Hi, everyone, and welcome to this agency nutrition training. We are going to be covering sodium today. So, we're going to be basically talking about sodium 101. So, what is sodium? What are the health effects of sodium? Who needs a low sodium diet? And then we'll wrap up with how can you promote low sodium foods at your agency. So, my name is Caitlin Price. I'm the Health and Nutrition Programs Manager here at the Food Bank.
And I am Maura Benner, and I am the JSY Community Health and Nutrition Coordinator here at the Food Bank. And we are both part of the Health and Nutrition team, and we're very excited to talk with you today. So just to kind of start off, what is sodium? So sodium is a naturally occurring mineral that is found in many different foods, but it is most present in the mineral that is salt. So while we don't want too much sodium in our diets, sodium is an essential mineral in the body that we need for several different essential processes. So some of those processes include muscle function, maintaining proper hydration, sending signals. The way to look at it is that sodium is an electrolyte that helps to regulate water in the body. And by doing that, it has such a vital part in keeping us healthy and active and performing our day-to-day activities. But of course, you do have minimums, and sometimes you get too much of some things. So, how much sodium do we really need to maintain those vital functions? So, the average person needs about 200 to 500 milligrams of sodium per day to maintain those vital processes. However, the recommended dietary allowance, or RDA, of how much sodium the average person can have is about 2,300 milligrams a day, which that equates to about 1 teaspoon of table salt. But just as a reminder, 2,300 milligrams is an average for an average person. So if you have certain health conditions, you might need less sodium in your diet. You might need more sodium in your diet. So of course, based on that, talk to your healthcare provider. But the average person only needs maximum of 2,300 milligrams a day. However, the average American diet puts us about getting 3,500 milligrams of sodium a day, which is, of course, a whole lot more than the recommended amount. So where is all of this sodium coming from? So as you can see from this chart from the CDC, it indicates that the majority of sodium in the American diet is coming from foods from a restaurant or that were made outside the home or from processed foods. Now, we just want to take a moment to explain here, like, what is a processed food? So to clarify, a food being processed is not necessarily a bad thing. According to the Department of Agriculture, processed foods is any raw agricultural product that has been altered from its natural state. So a food can be considered, or a product can be considered processed if it's just been washed, cleaned, chopped, cut, cooked, pasteurized, or packaged, or something like that. So a food being called processed or being processed does not automatically or inherently make it unhealthy. It's just that the more heavily processed a food is, that's when we can start to get more added extras such as more sodium. So those more heavily processed foods such as crackers, chips, deli meat, different frozen or pre-made meals, such as like a frozen pizza or a microwavable meals, those do contain to have or typically contain more caloric and nutrient content. And there is a lot of sodium that goes into these different products for a couple of reasons. First, because sodium acts as a preservative. So sodium helps to make a lot of those processed shelf-stable foods to last a lot longer. And sodium also helps things to taste really good. So that's why a lot of those products tend to have a lot of sodium in them. So the foods that are high in sodium are the foods that you would typically expect to, especially if they were to come from a restaurant. So as you can see on our picture here, we have different things showing like pizza, tacos, hamburgers, all that really great stuff. Other items that you might want to watch out for at a grocery store or corner store are some snack items, such as we mentioned, chips or pretzels, and then also some canned items like soups or different meals in a can, or ready-made meals that you can just get out of the packaging or grab as a to-go meal, such as like mac and cheese or such. Of course, heavily processed meats such as deli meat, bacon, sausage, fried chicken also tend to have a lot of high sodium in them. But there are also some items that might not clearly have a lot of sodium in them that you might want to watch out for. And that can be some things like canned vegetables or even pasta sauce.
All right. So, what are the health risks of having too much sodium in your diet? I'm sure a lot of us have heard before that sodium is correlated with blood pressure. So, if you are getting a lot of sodium in your diet, you are at risk for having higher blood pressure. And the reason that this happens is because, like Maura mentioned, sodium is an electrolyte. So, it actually pulls more water, more fluid into our bloodstream from the rest of our body. And that causes our blood to expand in volume and puts extra pressure on our arteries and makes the heart have to work harder to move the blood around because all that water has been pulled into it. So if we do have elevated blood pressure from high sodium intake, we are at increased risk of cardiovascular disease. So things like heart attack, stroke, and different things like that. So that's why we do have some concerns about sodium. And that's why we're talking today about ways to decrease your exposure to sodium. So who needs a low sodium diet? Like Mara mentioned earlier, a lot of us, especially here in America, are already getting above the recommended daily allowance of sodium. So we should all ideally be thinking about sodium in our diets and be striving for a lower sodium diet. But this is especially important for people who already have high blood pressure or people who have existing conditions like kidney disease or existing heart problems. All right. So now when we're thinking about decreasing sodium in our diets, either at home or when we're at the grocery store, we're going to talk through some strategies that you can use. And you could also talk about these strategies with your clients as well if they bring up a conversation about they themselves needing a low sodium diet. So we'll go into each of these more in depth, but our 4 strategies that we're going to talk about today are things to look for on the package, things to look for on the nutrition facts label. We'll talk through some at-home and in-store strategies, and then we'll also talk about how potassium is related to all of this. So firstly, the packaging. So I'm sure we've all seen things like reduced sodium or low sodium on a package before, and those are generally good things to see. But the FDA does regulate these terms really tightly. So each of these things actually means something slightly different. Food manufacturers aren't allowed to just put these things on the packaging willy-nilly. It has to be really correlated to these specific designations that the FDA has set. So some things to call your attention to would be reduced sodium. That means that it has at least 25% less sodium than the regular product. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a low sodium product. It just means that it has less sodium than the original. Still a good thing though to see on the label. Same with low sodium or salt or sodium free. Those would also be some really good things to look out for to make sure that you really are getting a food that's low in sodium. But these are just some things to look out for. And secondly, the other thing that we can look at on our packaging, especially for our more heavily processed foods, is the nutrition label. So you can see highlighted on this example nutrition facts label here, the line for sodium. And as a general rule of thumb, when we're talking about sodium, it's a good idea to check the percent daily value rather than the milligrams, since that's a little bit more easy to interpret. So the percentage on a nutrition facts label just means how much of your recommended daily allowance of sodium are you going to get from one serving of this food. So you can see that the RDA here is 28%, which is relatively high. So a good rule of thumb for knowing if something is high or low in any given nutrient that you're looking at on the nutrition label is to remember that if something has 5% or less of your daily value of that nutrient, it's low in that nutrient. And if it has 20% or more, we tend to think of it as high. So in this example, with 28% of your daily value of sodium, this food would be considered high in sodium. All right. And then we'll touch on some at-home and in-store strategies for ensuring low sodium diets. So, like Mara mentioned earlier, most salt in our diet and most sodium in our diet is added in processing or in prepared foods at restaurants. And we're not adding a ton of salt usually at home, but it is still an area that we can cut back in a little bit if we're trying to really watch our sodium intake. So in general, it's a good idea to focus on using herbs and salt-free seasonings for flavor rather than using salted seasonings like things like ranch packets or buffalo packets, taco seasoning packets, things like that. Those kind of pre-manufactured seasoning packets do tend to have higher levels of sodium. So when we're seasoning our food at home, it's a good idea to look out for these things. It's also a good idea to prep meals at home as much as possible. That way, you know that you are in control of how much sodium is being added to your food, because sometimes these things sneak up on you. Sometimes foods that you wouldn't even expect that you get from a restaurant or a prepared meal at a grocery store, you wouldn't even expect them to have as much sodium as they do. So when you're preparing meals at home, you know exactly what is going into that meal. Another good tip when you're at the grocery store would be to shop the outer aisles. So like Mara mentioned, in general, the more processed foods like crackers, chips, things like that tend to be on the inner aisles of the grocery store, and those also tend to be our higher sodium foods. And then the outer aisles tend to be our less processed foods. So things like fruits and vegetables, meats, dairy, things like that. So those things are naturally going to have less sodium than some of the things that are stored on the inner aisles of the grocery store. And then lastly, just as a extra little tip that you can implement, it's always a good idea to rinse your canned vegetables and beans. Like we mentioned, a lot of times, sometimes our vegetables and beans that we buy at the grocery store in a can do have salt added to help with preservation. And they've done some studies where they found that if you rinse them out in a strainer, just dump out the liquid and rinse them under the sink, that you can actually get rid of between 20 and 40% of the sodium in that can. So that's a nice, just extra tool to have in your back pocket to reduce the sodium in those items. All right. And then lastly, it's a good idea to get enough potassium as well. So potassium is another electrolyte that actually counterbalances the effects of sodium, and it helps our body to clear out excess sodium that we might have. So foods with potassium would include things like spinach, beans, bananas are a big one, as are potatoes, avocados, and squashes. So the ideal ratio is to have about 3 parts of potassium per 1 part of sodium. So if you're getting more potassium than you are sodium, you're probably going to be in a good spot to make sure that that balance is there in your body.
All right, so here are some ways and tips that you can use to identify low sodium foods on our food bank menu. So two main ways that we kind of highlight here is first using the nutrition ranking labels that you can see there. So the picture we have below of the corn, you can see there on the highlighted end that this is considered a choose often / green item. So that means that it is its sodium levels are within an acceptable low range to be considered a choose often item. So you can use that tool to gauge sodium that way as well. So if it was a choose yellow or choose sometimes product, then it would likely to have a higher sodium content than the choose often green product. One other way to kind of gauge that is that our purchased canned vegetables will always be low sodium. So if you ever see something in the category of wholesale, you can know that we have purchased that with keeping our nutrition levels and nutrition ranking in mind. However, different products such as TFAP items coming in or donated products will not necessarily have a low sodium designation. So just to kind of keep that in mind, another thing to look for is if we specifically put low sodium into the product name. That is a very easy way to tell if it's a low sodium item. Another way to kind of see using that same labeling is if it says it's a seasoned item, then typically that means that it will have added salt as well. And also just some of the items on our menu are likely always going to have a higher salt content. So things like our canned soups, canned chilies, mac and beef, different things like that are just going to usually be a higher sodium item. And I would not look to that in the future to probably be lower in sodium. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't a place for those in your pantry. We do know that a lot of those choose rarely items are really great in feeding our populations. But if you're watching for sodium, you might just want to consider that those might not be the best products for your populations that need those. So what are some different ways that you can help to promote low sodium items in your pantry? So first of all, you can create a low sodium section of your pantry. If you know that you have a lot of clientele or a lot of populations that are coming in that could use a low sodium area, you can just go ahead and put whatever low sodium items you have into this one specific section. That way, when folks come in to take a look at the shelves, they can very easily identify what products will work for them. So that's one solution. Another of them is that you can put up some different sodium education in your pantry. There are different things like posters, shelf talkers, different materials like that that you can have that are always visible. Or if you're interested, we do have a JSY nutrition educator that is a part of the food bank. There's also different outside resources such as Cornell Cooperative Extension that can help to host nutrition education classes. Or if you have different resources in your area, you can also get in touch with those as well. And they can help to provide yourself or others in your area with different sodium education materials. And then lastly, you can also provide recipes and different meal bundles that feature low sodium items. That can be a really great way to help folks get creative with the meals, especially with what you have in your pantry, while also promoting that home cooking aspect, as well as getting folks to use more of those low sodium items. So here at the food bank, we also have some additional resources to help with getting low sodium items to clientele. So first off, we are willing to help with any survey development. So if you are curious to learn about what are the dietary needs of those who are coming into your pantry, whether that be low sodium or any other kind of specific dietary need, we are willing to help with putting together a survey with different questions related to getting that information that you can distribute out to your patrons, and then we can get that information back to help you determine what might be the best choices in the future when ordering for your pantry. So that is first one resource that we have. To the left here, you can see that we've created these different sodium flyers. So we have two versions of this flyer, one that is for pantry education and then one that is for client information. It has a lot of the same information, but it kind of shifts to like, what are ways that if you're shopping in the pantry that you can look to choose low sodium items? And then what are some ways that we can help to make the pantry a little bit more low sodium friendly? So we do have those two sodium flyers that we're absolutely willing to share out with whoever is interested. And then also I am the coordinator for HPI, also known as the Healthy Pantry Initiative. And some of the strategies that we do in this program is working to develop those different low sodium tactics, such as having like a different shelf, supplying the pantry with different low sodium items, doing that different kind of survey development. So it's a lot of these different kind of informations in one program. So if you're ever interested in participating in the Healthy Pantry Initiative, you can always send me a message and I'm happy to talk with you about that as well. Thank you so much for taking some time to watch our video and learn about more low sodium items today. We appreciate you taking the time. And if you ever have any questions about low sodium items or anything else about sodium that you're curious, you can feel free to email Caitlin or I or the Health and Nutrition general email.
Thanks, everyone.